Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the direction of Tabaivka, where there has been significant changes in the front line. We start out with the Russians having made advances beyond the village and in the southern fields next to it. We've seen that the Russians have launched multiple attacks from Hochmelne and in the direction of Tabaivka, where they've managed to gain control over the forest patches next to it, which I mentioned in my previous video were very significant. We also take a look at the topographic map here, where we see that these forest patches are right next to the hills here to the west of Tabaivka. The Russians rushed the village from the heights and managed to get a foothold within the low grounds, and now they've managed to gain a foothold in the high grounds next to it. This is a very significant development for the fighting in this section of the front line, because if we zoom a bit out, we can see that these heights stretch out all the way to the villages to the northwest and overlooks all of Kupyansk. So if the Russians gain full control over these heights here, they can threaten the whole Ukrainian presence to the east of the Oskil River line, because they'll have the heights under their control. If they also manage to move in a northern direction here by Kotlярivka and Kislivka, which is right next to these areas where the Russians are already fighting from the high ground, then the Russians could start moving in a northern direction towards Petropavlivka, here to the south of Sinkivka. This would indicate that the Russians wouldn't be interested in capturing Sinkivka itself, but simply hold their presence there as they grind down the Ukrainians here in the front line, and then they'll be operating here in the heights or to the north of the current fighting to try and gain control over these important villages here to the east of Kupyansk rather than the ones to the north of the village. So we see that there's constant fighting here to the east, and the Russian recent advances shows that there's a heavy force behind it. Before we go more in depth as to the importance of these advances and what comes next, we have to talk about the Russian and Ukrainian strategy. We start out with the Ukrainian strategy because they are on the defensive, and that is what determines what offensive power will be used depending on what the Ukrainian defenders are doing. So what we're seeing as the Ukrainian defense is a mix of two strategies, two different tactics. The first one is active defense and the second one is defense in depth. The way that the Ukrainians are using these tactics is that active defense is the one where you move around a lot. You are very active in the movement of your forces. You have mobile units and you have static units. The static units occupy the trenches by the front line to slow down the offensive power. And then there's more mobile units that move around the front line to adapt to where the offensive power is using their strengths. So a very mobile defense. Defense in depth is a tactic that complements active defense, and the way it functions is there is a front line, like here to the east of the Oskil River line. This is the main defensive line of the Ukrainians, the Oskil River line. Then to the east of that, there are multiple villages and fortifications all throughout the fields and areas. All of these act as defensive positions. So there are multiple layers of defense. That is defense in depth. It is a deep level of defense. There's multiple layers to it. So these two complement each other in the sense that if the Russians attack and break through one of these defensive positions, like Hochmelne and Tabaivka, the Ukrainians will have enough time with their second line of defense, their second defensive position, to hold back the Russians for enough time for their mobile units to arrive without too much damage being done. So this would end up grinding down the Russian attacking force to a point where the Ukrainian defenders are able to launch a counterattack and prevent further advances or the breakdown of the defensive line. Because even if the Russians break through the first, second, or even the third line of defense, they will be in this process grinded down to a point where the Ukrainian defensive force will have a much easier time counterattacking and preventing further advances. This is what we have seen the Ukrainians do time and time again here to the west of the Serbets River, where the Russians made an advancement here by Serhivka, where they ended up losing half of their advancements because the Ukrainian counterattack came right after. We also see this in Avdiivka, in the Robotyne direction, every single part of the front line. The Ukrainians are using the exact same strategy. Now, what is on top of this is that the way the Ukrainians split up their forces, they have their defense in depth forces, which is the main defensive force, the one that's most numerous. They have their weakest soldiers taking up this role. The ones who are just mobilized, they get sent to the front into the trenches to hold the line. Those are the ones who are using the defense in depth tactic. As for the active defense tactics, that is the most well-trained and well-equipped elite force. This is why the counterattack always succeeds with much strength, because the Russian force, which is pretty much split in a sense of the strongest units and the weakest units being mixed together in the same unit, this means that the Russians who are attacking is a mix of the forces, while the Ukrainians defending are a weak force. So if the Russians even make a breakthrough against these weak forces, they'll still be grinded down, because a defensive force is always having an advantage over the aggressive force. Therefore, the Russians are being drained by weak Ukrainian soldiers with little equipment, while the stronger Ukrainian force comes in and strikes after the Russian force has been grinded down. This is why the Ukrainian defensive tactic has been so successful. Because even in times where the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses, like we've seen right here, constant Russian advances over the past few days, to now extend into a larger advance, now it's only a matter of time before Ukrainian counterattacks happens, and they'll likely lose territory, because Russians do not commit enough forces to hold onto these positions. So what the Russians need to do in this situation is create a trap for the Ukrainians. Because the tactic that the Russians are using for offensive operations is a pretty standard by-the-book definition of an offensive operation. They launch small assault groups that test out the Ukrainian defenses. They are small probing attacks. When they find a weakness, they launch a stronger force to try and overtake that position. If they take a position, they expand to areas which allow the position to be taken advantage of. The Hochmelny area and Tabeivka directions are both areas where the Ukrainians held as outposts, as defensive positions. They have an area that they defend. For example, Hochmelny had this area here to the south and to the east, north and west of it. This circle area right here is exactly what the Russians have taken after they took Hochmelny. As for the Tabeivka direction, the Russians would have to go in a western direction to take the heights. That is the area that Tabeivka was defending. Meanwhile, the Kotlyarivka and Kislivka directions are defending a much larger area, this whole section right here. If the Russians manage to take control over these two villages, then they move in a western direction. The Ukrainians know that, therefore they have multiple lines of defense in these areas to slow down the Russians when they are trying to advance and expand their zone of control after a breakthrough. So the Russians are simply just doing it by the book. The Ukrainians are responding with their own tactic, which has stayed the same for a long time now. And that exactly is their weakness. If the Russians already know what the Ukrainians will do, especially with the way they split up their forces, the Ukrainians are currently acting with the idea that they have these weaker frontline personnel who just fit up the space to slow down the Russians, and then they launch a counterattack with a much stronger force. This has succeeded well, because they can predict the Russian movement. But when that happens, that means that the Russians can also predict what the Ukrainians will do. Right now we see that the areas in which the Ukrainians will target in case of a counterattack is Tabeivka. The reason for that is Tabeivka itself is located in a valley and it is on the low ground. The Ukrainians have positions in the high grounds. So that is the most obvious place for the Ukrainians to counterattack in. And the Russians now know, okay, we have made a breakthrough, therefore a mobile Ukrainian elite force will come and counterattack. Therefore, the Russians need to counteract that by launching a different attack at a different place. That is what they have been doing. Whenever the Ukrainians move up to counterattack in an area, they just open up a new front, a new part of the front line that they attack in. But that is just avoiding the problem. The Russian problem is the Ukrainian mobile elite force. Therefore, to deal with the problem itself, the Russian needs to simply create a strong elite mobile force themselves. One that is stronger than the Ukrainian one, because the Ukrainians would expect that this is how it goes. But if the Russians suddenly build up an elite mobile force that is going to act as a second wave when the Ukrainian counterattack happens, then they can draw up more units, especially since the Russians now have a larger pool of infantry and equipment to pull out from due to their mobilization, continuous mobilization and volunteer forces. The Russian idea should be to create their own force that can match this Ukrainian force and simply have it bigger or stronger than the Ukrainian one to then when the Ukrainians launch a counterattack to try and recapture the positions, they may even succeed. And then when they have been drawn out and grinded down by the Russians who took this area, they launch their own counterattack towards this Ukrainian force and try to destroy it. Their goal should always be to encircle it, because if the Russians can take down the Ukrainian elite forces that move around and counteract the Russian breakthroughs, that is when we can see larger Russian operations. The reason why we do not see any of the Russian operations developing into something bigger is because the Ukrainians always stop them as soon as they happen with their own counterattack. This is why the Ukrainians have a significant reserve force, not because they simply sit back in the back line waiting for something to happen and just sit there sleeping. It is because they are actively moving behind the front line, as the weakest and least trained, least equipped soldiers take the brunt of the casualties. The elite force is mostly untouched. So that is the defensive strategy of the Ukrainians, and that is the offensive strategy of the Russians. And this is why the fighting is as it is, because the Russians simply do not respond properly to this Ukrainian defensive strategy, which has stayed the same for over a year now. And that is exactly what we're seeing throughout the front line. We're seeing constant Russian breakthroughs in a very small scale, and as soon as they happen, they end up in a stalemate where the Ukrainians constantly counterattack with much stronger units who are simply waiting for this Russian breakthrough. And that is why we see that sometimes they simply just take an advancement, like here south of Novomikhailivka, and now they're pushed back because this mobile unit came and pushed them back, because the Russians had grinded themselves down, hitting the Ukrainian weak soldiers, giving them a large amount of casualties, but the core of the Ukrainian army is still standing very strong, because the brunt of the casualties is taken by the weakest mobilized units of Ukraine. This is a very cruel strategy, of course, as just normal civilians who were pulled from the streets are sent to the front just to take casualties, take the brunt of the force of the Russian army. But again, there's no other option when you simply cannot train your soldiers, because you're at war and the Russians are just so much more when it comes to firepower and everything else. They simply need this meat wave to hold the Russian army back. But this again is why we're seeing that there's so much effort to get new soldiers mobilized, as the Ukrainians will soon run out of this meat shield front line that they've been holding on for a long time. And that is all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.